L'appuntamento a cui state per partecipare è il primo degli incontri di Privacy for Futures. In risposta a un panorama normativo che è sempre più complesso, a rapide interruzioni tecnologiche e all'assenza di approcci strategici e prospettici alla privacy, Privacy for Future rappresenta un cambiamento fondamentale verso l'apprendimento e lo sviluppo anticipatori nella gestione della privacy. Con l'obiettivo di potenziare i professionisti della privacy e della protezione dei dati, Privacy for Future offre intuizioni preziose sulle metodologie di previsione, dotandoli di strumenti avanzati per navigare e affrontare le sfide emergenti nel dominio in continua evoluzione della privacy. Privacy for Future è una piattaforma di apprendimento interattivo che favorisce un ambiente dinamico in cui i pari si impegnano e imparano gli uni dagli altri, guidati da un focus sulla comprensione, la condivisione e l'anticipazione, rispondendo alle esigenze di evoluzione dell'ecosistema della privacy. Privacy for Future è il risultato di un impegno collaborativo tra 3 entità altamente qualificate nel panorama italiano e internazionale. 42 law firm e P4I offrono competenze di alto livello e una rete di contatti significativa, mentre Longviews assicura la solidità delle metodologie e dei processi nel campo del foresight e del pensiero futuro. Se volete essere parte di questa nuova avventura, trovate più informazioni a www.privacyforfuture.it. Iniziamo!
Let's start. Ciao Max. Thank you so much for being here today, and for the people looking at the stream, we are live. It's 11 and 37 minutes, and unfortunately right now our panel will be held in English language as well. On my part, what I call English is something similar with Mario accent, but don't worry, si sente benissimo. Let's see. They told me audio is not really working. Okay. Funny thing about starting.
Is it better? I see that there are audio problem. Is it better right now? Audio pessimo. Let's see what. It was quiet normal. Yeah. It was quiet normal. Okay, this should be fine. This should be fine. Everything should be fine. Just tell us if everything is fine. Okay.
You're okay now. Cool.
Let's start again. The beauty of being alive, you know? What the hell compelled me to go there? So, as you may know, Max is quite an important person, you know.
I'm not sure.
You're not sure. For the few of you that do not understand, that do not know exactly Max Schrems, who is Max Schrems, I will take just a description from Wikipedia that says an Austrian activist, lawyer and author who became known for campaigns against Facebook for its privacy violations, including violation of the European privacy laws and alleged transfer of personal data to the National Security Agency, the NSA, as part of the NSA's PRISM program. Schrems is the founder of NOIB, European Center of Digital Rights. NOIB is the largest no-profit, I think, right now, dealing with international issues about data transfer and all the part of data.
Yeah, I think especially for litigation, we're probably the biggest one. There is a lot of other NGOs that do more policy work and lobbying and all that kind of stuff, but actual litigation in that sense, we're probably the ones that really do that.
Okay, so I asked you to come here, thanks to Privacy for Future, just to talk about the hot topic for most professionals here in Europe. And the hot topic is data transfer. Not because it's well, I don't think it's, technically speaking, the most important one on usage of data. I think it's the one that has the largest impact on businesses all around Europe right now.
It's, let's say, one of the topics that if you do paper compliance pops up quicker than other topics. Let's do it that way. But even for us, it's probably 5% of our work. Like we do much other topics as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So I've prepared a couple of questions, but since I needed intelligent questions, I couldn't be providing that myself. And so I asked a couple of colleagues in Privacy for Future to write them down. So I will start from the first one, starting from a woman, because she will kick me if I do not start with her. So it's a self-preservation. It's just that. That is... Okay. Anna Cataletta, you met her, Anna, a couple of minutes ago. That is senior partner of P4I and is co-founder of Privacy for Future. Over the years, and also before your activism, well, mainly because your activism on the matter, data transfer practices have been challenged. This has led to revision and updates of these practices in the context... In the context, have you observed a substantial improvement in safeguards for the individuals involved, or are we still at the same point when we were before Schrems I?
Good question. Yeah, I think the biggest problem here, and that probably speaks to a very big issue in privacy in general, is we do have now 2 decisions by the Court of Justice that kind of say what you should do. But then we realized that in practice, that's hardly done. So we do see, I think, that people got a bit more like...
It's the most polite way of describing I've ever seen from you.
Usually the problem that we see, I think, is really like a rule of law issue in that area, that we do have a fundamental right. We do have, the Court of Justice even says that's a violation of the essence of your fundamental right. And then the industry just continues doing it anyways. And to a large extent, what we really have is a big enforcement problem in the whole privacy bubble. And that really plays out here. I mean, for the data transfers, it's probably not necessarily always the biggest privacy violation for the average Joe. It is, however, a big issue for, let's say, people that are journalists, activists, politicians, decision makers in big companies, because that is typically people where the NSA is interested in what you're doing. A lot of these surveillance laws that we have are geared towards how can we spy on Europe, the rest of the world. And it's interesting also from a, let's say, political view, that we're not more worried about our data going to the US not being protected there. And for me, it's interesting because in the US, that became suddenly a big issue. Once China got their data, then suddenly they were worried about it, or we discuss everything with TikTok. But if you realize that, I don't know, your LinkedIn data or your Facebook or Instagram data goes to the US, or most of your Google Mail or whatever you use, or Microsoft, that usually is much more interesting data than what's on TikTok in reality. And that is available to the NSA. So for us, it was really an interesting situation as the question says. It's like, we know these rules exist. They have a purpose, actually, but they're largely ignored. And it's a bit like, oftentimes say, like, privacy is oftentimes like a situation where people just build huge houses in a nature protection area where you shouldn't be allowed to build anything. And now you're sitting there, it's like, you would actually have to wreck this whole house now, and no one wants to do that. And the legislator or the executive doesn't really want to say, guys, you did that. And
please destroy that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a bit the problem. Like, we really, I mean, ever since the 90s, these laws exist. But also ever since the 90s, we ignore them. And so we built a whole like technical infrastructure that is largely not compliant with the law to a certain extent. My hope to probably also get into a solution here is, first of all, the easiest way would be that the US would grant proper protections to foreigners as well. Because the interesting thing on the mass surveillance part is that we actually agree in Europe and in the US that this type of surveillance is unconstitutional. Like under the Fourth Amendment to the US Constitution, the NSA surveillance is not allowed. as long as done on Americans. And the big problem here is that they basically say, as long as it's done on foreigners, we can do what the fuck what we want because we're partners, but no rights for partners. That's kind of the interesting thing. So once we would have a common set of rules and kind of a no spy agreement or some agreement between the US and the European Union, or among, let's say, democratic countries to say there's a certain baseline, you need to have probable cause, you need to have a judge approving it, all these things that we actually have in all these countries, also in data transfers across borders, which is even an issue in Europe. Like as an Austrian, I don't have protections in Germany, which is stupid.
Yeah.
So I think that is something we need to fix. Once we would fix that, the data transfer issues would be much easier. As long as that's not done, I think the reality for the next probably decade or two is that we'll have kind of geographic regions when it comes to data in general, or online laws in general, because we now talk about privacy, but if you think about, like, let's say freedom of speech, there's a different view of freedom of speech in China. Then there's one in Europe that may say, for example, the denial of the Holocaust is a crime in Austria, which the Americans think is freedom of speech. So there is these different realities. And as long as we have democracies and different cultures, we will have different rules. And that will mean you have to apply software differently and comply with different laws. So I think in the short term, or in the next probably decade or two, we'll probably have to localize much more, even though I'm not a big proponent of that or a big fan of it. But the reality is, if we want to comply with the laws locally, we'll have to adapt systems that way. In the long term, I think what would be good is for topics, especially like government surveillance, where we have very similar views, it would be actually quite cool to have international agreements among the democratic countries to make sure that these frictions are not existent anymore. That would be my, let's say, medium-term hope, but that requires politics. Like that requires especially the US government or the US politicians to realize that that's useful for them. And the way to do that is to say, guys, you're making shitloads of money with international customers. Once you have these international customer data, they also deserve some protection, because right now the US is having this proposition to say, give us all the data, we're the cloud provider of the whole world. But once the data is here, you actually have no rights.
Yeah.
And I joke a bit, it's like Switzerland saying, give us all your gold, we host it. But actually, once the gold in Switzerland, you don't have property rights as a foreigner. Like no one the fuck would buy that bargain. And I think in the long run, the US will have to realize that as well, because customers will simply say, okay, that is not a good deal. And I also think that certain, edge cases where they probably had some technology that was a bit more edgy than the European provider, that also goes away. Like a lot of that became standard. You can buy it everywhere else as well. So that may also be a factor that this could also change a bit.
Yeah, and we tend as a European to say bad things about Europe. Normally, we do like our sovereignty. So Europe is seen as, or more often than not, Europe is seen as something hindering our national power. But in this point of view, being part of a loosely coordinated part of the world would be much easier, even for foreigners and for foreign companies like Google, Meta, etc., because it's complying not to every single country's law, but most of the time complying with some transnational accord.
And with a lot of that, I mean, first of all, we have the rules that are European-wide now, but a lot of that is actually becoming more global in the sense of like Convention 108, ever since the 1980s, has actually foreseen privacy protections. And even if you look at the US, I mean, they're not having exactly the same law, but Mexico has some kind of privacy law. Canada has some kind of privacy law. So it's oftentimes, I think, in the national discussion, Brazil, and I mean, a lot of them have like, let's say, a 108 somewhat compliant thing, and that's going to grow at a certain extent. So I think even that if you look at it globally among the, let's say, Western countries at least, you see that the US becomes more and more isolated as this one country not having that. So I think that is actually interesting on the commercial side, that even there, I think even there's a majority in the US, the reality is just in the US political system, you can't get anything done anymore. Probably otherwise they would have a privacy law by now as well. So that may also happen. What's really interesting on the government surveillance side, usually Europe even allows more than the US. Like the US is terrified of the government. They're not, like, if you look at it, Austria has, I think, about as many wiretaps a year than the whole US federal government has. Like, we are actually much more permissive here. Just that we have developed towards the system of human rights that apply to every human. So if you're Chinese, you also have the same rights in Europe, while the US is still historically under their constitution, that's just a couple of 100 years older, still following the citizens' rights approach. And that conflicts on the internet, because you always have people that are not citizen in your country, and I think that is one of these historic reasons why we have this problem. But I think it's gradually gonna be resolved. In this case, I mean, we're right now preparing Schrems III. We're just going to go to the Court of Justice another time. The Court of Justice will probably tell everybody the same thing again that they told before. So it's a bit of like a lot of energy waste that is happening here for everybody involved, also the companies that now have to deal with this. But for us, it's a bit hard to also have the European Commission just ignore the Court of Justice over and over again, which is becoming, for me, even more than a privacy topic, becomes a rule of law issue. Yeah. If the Commission usually tells everybody in the European Union, you have to abide the rule of law, it's important, blah, 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 European law. But once it actually comes to the Commission, accepting other countries, then politics is more important than law. So I think that is also going to be a factor that is interesting, because the judges in both of the hearings that we had were actually very strong on the point that they said, we're now a constitutional court after the Lisbon Treaty. If the Commission goes too far in their political decisions, it's our role to stop it. While the Commission was a bit like, oh, that's political, just don't get involved. And I was interested because I think it's also going to be a matter of the authority of the court. If the court already told the Commission twice you can't do this, and they're doing it again and again, it's a bit like, if your parent and your kid is doing the same thing the third time that you told it not to do, you're probably escalating the situation and you're not holding back. So that may be a situation here as well that we'll see.
The United States stance on that remembers closely for us Italian civis Romanus sum. I'm a citizen of the Roman Empire, so I have different rights than everyone else.
And that's, I mean, once you have a beer, that usually comes up quite. I mean, I was an exchange in the US and I love the US on many ways, but this idea of we're more special than the others is a reality. Like, that's also what everybody tells you after at least having a drink, maybe not before, but after having a drink, they literally tell you, we're not going to have rights for foreigners, because as a politician in the US, if I grant rights to foreigners, I get kicked out.
Yeah, of course.
If I grant rights or remove rights from foreigners, I get votes. I mean, something that is not unknown to us either. Yeah. But that's a bit of the reality that we have here. So I think the way, the theory of change, as you call it that way, would be that the US industry has a problem to even sell their products in Europe anymore, which would require enforcement and require European customers to say, I'm not buying this anymore. That would generate enough pressure within the US to say, guys, your laws are actually hurting our international business. Yeah. And that could be a theory of change where this could actually happen. I don't think that if the Commission knocks on the door that will help anything. No.
Next question. Giuseppe Vaciago, partner in 42 law firm and co-founder of PrivacyForFutures. Data is seen by many as the necessary fuel of our digital society. That is. This places tremendous strategic value on data sharing and data transfer. In the light of this, what balance do you perceive between geopolitical consideration and the legislative goal of protecting the rights and freedom of data subject in the decisions made by the European Court of Justice concerning data transfer between the United States?
Yeah, that's actually quite an interesting question. So we usually, with most of the litigation we also add, this is how you can do it right. So we're also, myself, I'm like the person that, started programming and loves computers and took it apart when I was a kid already. So I think it's interesting because I don't see privacy versus like data processing necessarily as a conflict. I see it more of it doing it well. It's kind of like, it's not like organic farming is against farming. It's like doing farming maybe in a more intelligent way, so to say, if you believe in that. So that is a bit how I see privacy in general. So I think if software is done well, or if products are done well, they would usually, sell better as well, or in the long term be probably more sustainable. And then there's just a limit on how far you can go. Same thing in consumer rights. You can obviously have the most crazy terms, and that may be good for business, but there's a limit of what we accept in consumer rights as well. So I think that's a bit the dimensions I think in. On the data transfer specifically, I personally would be a big fan. I'm a globalist personally, so I would be a big fan if we would have one pool of, let's say, democratic countries that agree on certain standards, and we could have a free flow of data. That is personally what I think is the solution. But that requires politicians. So for us, that's really be it business advisors or privacy people, really hard to achieve, because that would require basically an act of Congress in the US. And that is hard for us to do.
Well, not only that, it would be very difficult to approach for many politicians that rely on being over nationalists, and so it's a difficult stance to take, even.
And for me, even politically, it's hard in the sense like I hate the nationalism that is growing right now, and at the same time, you're used to say, oh, we need to like nationalize everything. And I mean, there is a certain argument to have, you know, core services run under your jurisdiction where you can also make sure that it's really compliant and you can actually check it. But I would ideally favor a system where we can trust each other enough to not have everything on our own soil, but trust enough that someone else does stuff well as well. But we're not there yet. So it's a bit like, you know, a chicken and egg issue. And I think there is, I mean, also some political changes that we simply have that we also have to consider. One like totally technical approach that was interesting that at some conference someone raised was like, you know, now where they're blowing up gas pipelines, after all, we're connected to the US with like 10 cables or 20 cables or so. Super easy to just cap off. If your data is on the other side, it's not even about the US doing something. It's just like technically not able to reach it anymore. So there is arguments for some of that to think if that's relevant. And we already see that in reality because of latency reasons and technical reasons. Most of the data is already in Europe anyways, physically. It's then a bit of a question if it still falls on the US jurisdiction, or if we then say, okay, if the data is in Europe, we're European customers, it's data from the European Union, maybe the GDPR should be the controlling instrument and not the NSA law. And that is...
just maybe.
Yeah. And that is, I think, if you zoom out on a very high level, what we have here is a conflict of jurisdictions, and we'll have that much more in the sense that for the 2000s, 2010s maybe, there was this feeling of the internet is the wild, wild west, nothing is regulated, everything's fine, everybody can do whatever they want to do. Now that's fine, as long as there is no rules, there is no conflict of law. Now we have the next step where suddenly all the governments start to regulate everything that's online. And if you look at the European Union, we pass a new digital law for something about every half a year. So, and you see China and Russia and the US and everybody else passing laws as well. So what we'll now have is a conflict of law situation where simply you're a company and one jurisdiction tells you A and another jurisdiction tells you B. And you'll have to decide which one you want to follow, or you split your operations and follow each one of them. And that will probably be the reality for the next 10 or 20 years, because the more it's going to get regulated on a national or like geographically limited level and not on the international level, we will have these conflicts simply. I think that is good to understand or know for, you know, planning your projects for the next 10 or 20 years, that you may have to choose which side you're going to be on, or that you have separate systems that run in different geographies. And we already have that with China, for example. A lot of people told me, it's like, if you operate in China, the Chinese are serious about their laws. You have to like host it there, do everything there, and follow.
We have a question about that. Yeah. So
and that's just a reality of operating in these jurisdictions.
Let's switch to the third question. Stefano Leucci, fellow at Nexus Center. During the 3 years without a data transfer agreement between US and EU, the number of sanction issues was, less than 10. Yep. Considering your experience with NOIB in filing several complaints on internet services implying data transfer toward the United States, for example, Google Analytics, what is your perception of data protection authorities' approach to this issue across Europe?
The simple answer is like, can't see it, not there, let's pretend it's not here, let's hope something is coming up. And I think it's not just the DPAs. What we have is an overall, in German you call it Mikado, like this game where all the sticks are there and they're not allowed to move. Yep. And
I think it's called something like that in the rest of Europe, so it's fine.
And we call it usually a Mikado situation where everybody just doesn't move, hoping that someone else starts to move. And that is what we had. Basically, the DPAs were hoping that the European Commission comes up with some new deal. The European Commission was basically hoping for the US to move. For the US to have moved, that would have required enforcement in the European Union. Yep. Then the big tech companies were like, okay, no enforcement, no customers run away, so no problem. Once the customers would have gotten enforcement, they would have run away at some point. Yep. There would have been that pressure. So overall, everybody waited for the other one to take action. And then the end result was that Ursula von der Leyen and Biden had an afternoon coffee in Brussels at some point and said, "Oh, we just do a new deal." And as far as I understand, even the people that negotiated these deals know that this is not going to hold up. But it's a political decision that's now what we're doing. And for as long as the new deal is going to be there, that is going to be the law of the land until it's annulled. What's interesting is that the Court of Justice annuls backwards. It's an ex tunc annulment. So all your data transfers, literally since 2000, are basically without a legal basis unless you had the SECs. I think going forward, most companies will use the FCC still, plus maybe the transfer. Forgot how the new deal is even called. TATF, I know is the acronym. Plus the new deal, and we'll just basically wait and see as well. I think what's interesting also is to think if you, for example, have a new setup, if you change anything in your setup, anyways, to really consider if all of this drama is worth it. In a sense of if I pay 5% more on hosting in Europe, but I save 10% on my legal department, then I still make some money and not have this shit going on. So I think that is also a factor that people gradually realize that this is not going to be solved anytime soon. And you're basically like jumping from one thing to the next, hoping that it's not going to go under. I don't think it's worth it necessarily. I can tell us our own setup. We started obviously with a setup in Europe from the get-go with our organization. And as a nonprofit, you also have a good amount of data of people. And my compliance was simple. It was one email to saying, "Oh, you really don't have any sub-processors?" They're like, "No, we really don't have any sub-processors, thank you." And that was it. And I think there's some beauty in that as well, to not try to kind of, get on the fringes of the law and try to argue it somehow. But to instead just say, okay, why don't I host it just there and be done with it? Which depends on the system that you're running and what you need and your requirement. That's not possible for everybody. But to be honest, for a lot of the standard stuff, it is possible by now.
And it's a sort of the standard that is going to be followed, because right now you have the ability, even if you are in a multi-tenancy hosting, most of the companies large enough to be interested in any kind of litigation already use that kind of services that allow for different hosting in different countries.
And the smaller ones oftentimes just, I can tell you for us, a lot of the stuff that we do is open source standard software that you install with a click of a button on server A or B, and you can move it overnight and it's there and I'm done with it. So it's also, I think, interesting, and that is not my expertise, but what I see is that there is this feeling of we have to do everything in these 2 providers or 3 providers, as if there wouldn't be 100 others. And my kind of, for myself, the one where I really struggled to find someone was a newsletter, like email newsletter, because it needs to be servers that are set up well, otherwise all your newsletters go to spam, blah, blah, blah. But all of them use tracking like fuck. Like all these newsletters are tracked like crazy and you can't turn it off. And as a privacy NGO, really hard to send out a newsletter that has tracking in it.
I feel you.
So we found actually a local Austrian provider that does all of that. To be honest, their interface looks like from the 90s, but it works. But the fun thing is we wanted to have an import function. For example, I emailed them, and the head of the company is emailing back. It's like, "Hey, that's a good idea. We implement it." Next day, I had an API that did that. I was like, okay, you don't get that at Google. And I think that there's a bit of that partly as well to kind of try around and look at it. What's a bit missing, I think, is also from the industry side, good, good comparisons, good like alternatives. Like I think a lot of people just struggle to find a list of alternatives that they feel comfortable with and that they know work as well. Because we also have to be honest, like a lot of the stuff is not working well. And so there is some feeling of let's go with the big guy because we know it's working. And that may be a bit of an issue here as
even
well.
doing simple things very good and with a lot of reliability. It's not as easy as many would think. I can understand for newsletters, because normally speaking, right now newsletters are made for be tracked. So the normal the more funnel you use is giving
until you realize that actually newsletter tracking is not working, because I then looked into it and was like, so I think what has like Google opens all the emails automatically, so you get 100% open rate on Gmail because apparently they do that on I think it was Gmail, but one of them. And then
Microsoft too. If you have got,
and then Outlook blocks everything, so even people read it, you see them not as being read. There's like it's actually one of the most non-workable tracking things, anyways. Plus, as a privacy NGO, the discussion ends quickly because you realize that 90% of your followers have every blocker installed that exists. So all your numbers are wrong anyways.
9 out of 10. And the 10th one will just make a fuss for each and every.
Exactly. So we just gave up on it.
Well, I'm not telling you he wouldn't be right in making a fuss, but he will do.
And for us, it's a bit like we see how many link clicks we have. That's the definite metric, and I know
how many link back you got.
Exactly.
That's it. So, Gabriele Fagioli, CEO at Digital 360. Do you think that the actual data transfer agreement between EU and US is stable? And if not, it will ever be possible to reach a stable data transfer agreement, and how? You sort of talked about that, but it's easy.
So maybe to kind of take a second here, because it's something that a lot of people are really interested in. So for the new transfer agreement, you have a couple of elements why it's not going to work. First of all, on the commercial side of data usage, the Court of Justice requires that it's essentially equivalent. Now, if you look at the Privacy Shield principles that are now the new principles again, they're exactly the same wording as before. And if you look, for example, you would need a legal basis under 6.1 to process data. So typically consent or one of the other 6. And what's interesting is that the new deal doesn't even require that. So the new deal basically says any recipient can use the data as much as they want. And you only are able to opt out in 2 very specific situations. So as a customer, you would have to know that the sub processor received your data, which you usually don't know. Then you would have to go to that website and then find some link where you can somehow opt out of them sharing the data further. Not going to happen. You just have to kind of put that next to Article 6.1 and say, that's not essentially equivalent, and you can do the same thing with most other principles of the GDPR. So already on the commercial side of this system, this has to break. There is just, the difference is too extreme. Now, on the government surveillance side, there is the European Commission is very good in doing PR around that. Is that they say, oh, there is a new executive order. Wonderful, the new executive order.
Sorry, I shouldn't be laughing, but I can see the irony.
Yeah, it is. It's interesting because even if you looked at the Privacy Shield, they back then said that the US, it was a marvelous wording, that the US confirmed that there is no mass surveillance or told them that. It didn't say that the Commission confirmed it, but the US government told them that everything is fine, so to say. It's a bit like China telling you everything is fine on mass surveillance in China, and the Commission just writing that into a decision because if China says fundamental rights are great in China, then they have to be great. That's kind of like the approach that we're taking here. And that's, again, the one we do here. Now, with the new executive order, what's interesting is that it's presented as if there wouldn't have been an executive order before. Actually, there was PPD 28, which was the Obama executive order.
Yeah.
And now you have to put these two side by side and compare them, and you realize that almost everything in the new executive order is also in the old one. And the Court of Justice already looked at the old one and said, no, not good enough. So on that side, there is a couple of things that even got worse. So, for example, in the old executive order, there were 6 legal bases for mass processing or for mass surveillance. In the new one, it's 8. We have 2 more. Now it's also for combating climate change. Apparently, you can mass surveil the whole world for climate change. And the other one was for pandemics, which is basically Corona law. But then you wonder if that is proportionate and so on. Anyways, now talking about proportionality, one of the big new things, and that would have been mind-blowing if it would be true, is that the new executive order says that the surveillance by the US has to be proportionate. Now, proportionality is usually what we have in the charter that the Court of Justice tested and said the US surveillance is not proportionate. Now, the interesting thing is that the Court of Justice said FISA 702 is not proportionate. The new executive order says surveillance has to be proportionate. And they say, however, that they still continue the surveillance exactly as it was before. Now, these 3 things cannot be true at the same time.
Yeah.
And the magic trick is that the US used the word proportionality as in the European Union, but gives an American meaning to it.
Yeah.
So it's like we have a European scale that goes from here to there of proportionality, and then we have an American scale that is somewhere outside of that. And Americans can still say, oh, we're proportionate under our definition, even though we're not proportionate on the European definition. Now, that can only be the dream of some bureaucrat or diplomacy guy or whatever that basically just tries to get...
It's damn genius. You have to consider that it is damn genius.
Yeah, it's just like, it's a pocket player trick, basically, to say we use the same word, but then have a different definition of it. That is fundamentally the big change there. And imagine you're at the Court of Justice. Imagine you're one of the judges that already told them to fuck off with the old deal. And now they're telling you, but there is an American proportionality. How about that? And I mean, it's going to be so obvious.
Pissed off about the largest scale possible.
And that is really one of the issues. It's going to become a matter of the authority of the Court of Justice as well. If you're the Supreme Court of the European Union and tell them twice this is not doable, and they come back with the same shit just with a new label on it, they will test that even more than before, and they have to, because it's really it becomes really a rule of law issue of do we have a Court of Justice that ultimately is the arbitrator about fundamental rights, or is the Commission simply free to just pass it so often that everybody gets bored and then just walks away? And I mean, it's maybe a very Austrian version of thinking about that. We had this right-wing populist in the 90s. We had all of that 20 years before the rest of Europe, or 10 years before the rest of Europe. And we have in the south of Austria, it's a bilingual area, so the street signs would have to be bilingual, but no one knew what the percentages of when it has to be bilingual or not wasn't defined. So one lawyer kind of brought a case, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court, the Constitutional Court, and they said it has to be bilingual. Now, that politician, instead of making a bilingual sign, took the sign in front of all the media and concreted it back in 5 meters down the road and said, oh, it's a new sign, so the judgment does not apply. And this is literally what the European Commission is doing here. It's just like, oh, it's a new deal. And so, and at some point it's going to be really interesting if the judges are just going to get even more and more and more aggressive on that, because it's really a matter of authority and constitutional fabric of the European Union. That we see here, and that may be another factor that probably the privacy community doesn't think that much about, but in the larger European Union fundamental rights and constitutional doctrine, that's really important, that the Court of Justice also just doesn't back down and say, okay, just pass it 5 times, and the 5th time we're just going to look the other way.
I would say that it's a reputational problem about the court itself, because if it's so easy to circumvent every kind of pronunciation, well, that is a problem.
And that is already easy because of timing. So the Court of Justice usually takes a couple of years until they can annul something. And the Commission theoretically is very quick in passing things. In reality, it takes very long as well. But it's kind of like that they can outpace the Court of Justice, so to say. So one thing that we'd like to apply for as well, which would be novel, and I don't like it has a 10% chance to actually work, would be for the Court of Justice to pause the application of the new deal for the time it's being reviewed. That would take 1.5 years out of the process. So that for the meantime, they would say, okay, this we have already decided twice that it doesn't work. Looks like it's very much the same. It's millions of people's data that goes to the US, and we already said that's a violation of fundamental rights. So we pause the application of the new deal for the time being. Very unlikely to happen, but it would be one option for the Court of Justice to go ahead, become ahead of this kind of game, and turn the dynamics a bit. And that would be one of the hopes, that it's just going to be a message to say, okay, we're not going to be fucked around with this anymore. Again, not likely, but would be interesting.
I wouldn't bet on it.
Mine either. My money is on the other side. But we would still make the application, just because the Court of Justice can only decide about it once there is an application, and then
worth the try. Wouldn't bet on it.
It's a 3-pager really to argue, and it would give them the option to go ahead on that.
Okay. Alessandro Ortalda, MD of the Brussels Privacy Hub, that wrote you and you didn't read. Currently, the predominant focus from society, and you looking at your involvement with Schrems I and II cases, has centered on data transfer challenge between United States and the European Union. Do you see similar issues with other jurisdictions, legal system, or countries?
Similar, not necessarily. The US is definitely, I mean, it's a democracy, there is rule of law. In my view, the US system has a lot of problems just because it's very ancient and wasn't updated in many ways. But that's largely historic, and we're probably culturally not too far off. The big difference with the US is that our data is factually there. So we oftentimes have to think about how about China and Russia and so on. We literally at NOIB, I mean, we run more than 800 cases. We literally, I think, other than TikTok, never had any serious China issue in any of the software stack that we looked into.
Okay.
So from a factual perspective, the US is the one big player that we're talking about here. And that is the reason why we also focus on that. If tomorrow all of Europe would suddenly decide, hey, we're hosting in China, which, by the way, for good reasons, no one does, we would probably have to look into that as well. Yeah. But right now, we don't have a jurisdiction that has similar breadth of surveillance laws and similar possibility to actually do surveillance, in the sense of Sweden has very broad surveillance laws. Partly France has very broad surveillance laws, Germany a bit. But most of our data is actually not in these jurisdictions. So we usually, because we're limited and we're based on donations, like we just run on donations.
You're using the Pareto strategy.
We're basically looking at what is the biggest issue to look at.
Pareto strategy, 20% of the effort, 80% of the data.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's the reason we focus on that. One topic that came up a bit and that would be interesting is the UK, because now there are...
I was thinking about that.
And there is a bit of a, to be honest, on my side, a bit of like, this is such a fucked up topic with the whole Brexit that I didn't want to like add fuel to the fire. But now gradually, I mean, we're now reestablishing these relationships and have to define them anew. And it is interesting because the US does have, the UK does have very broad surveillance laws as well. And what's a bit weird is under EU law, the national security of member states is exempt from the jurisdiction of the European Union. Yep. So the Court of Justice cannot actually, I mean, there's discussions and there is ways maybe that the Court of Justice cannot that easily, let's put it that way, have jurisdiction over the national security of Germany or France. But it would have a lot of options, like it does have full jurisdiction over third countries because they don't fall under the exemption. So the UK would suddenly get into the jurisdiction of the Court of Justice for sure. What's a bit different with the UK is that they still have Article 8 of the Charter, so they're still part so long. Yeah. Let's see what they do on that.
For the time being,
they would still fall under Strasbourg jurisdiction, so there's a bit of a baseline guarantee. The big problem with the Strasbourg and Strasbourg and Luxembourg situation here is that Strasbourg is very permissive when it comes to government surveillance. If you look at the case law, they're like, you go do whatever you want to do.
And I can understand the reasons.
Yeah, it's also a broader jurisdiction and has different history. Luxembourg is very much on the other side of the courts, even if you compare it to national courts. The Luxembourg Court of Justice rules are usually very strong. Also, if you look at European surveillance, like data retention or something like that, where they were much more outspoken than many of the national courts are. So for us, it's always interesting to get into the jurisdiction of Luxembourg because that's the one that actually looks at stuff.
Next question. Gabriele Rizzo. What critical issue do you see arising from the tension between data transfer being strongly constrained by norms and regulation and being liberalized by market pressure?
Yeah, it's a question of do you have rule of law or not, I think, to a certain extent. And we can, theoretically, we can change the laws. To do that, we would, I think what's important to stress is all of that is not done just under the GDPR. Our cases are basically done based on the charter rights. And there's logic to it in the sense if you can only guarantee these charter rights if you make sure the data is here, because once it leaves your jurisdiction, there is no protection anymore. So in reality, ever since the 90s, we have kind of an export control of data in the European Union, which is we don't have export control on many things, like that is a very strict rule. At the same time, if you look at, for example, other import laws, I mean, we debated about having a deal with the US on chlorinated chicken or not, and I'm not sure if chlorinated chicken is that important really, versus all your data going to the US. But
it's important.
But I mean, if you see at other trade negotiations, it's very normal that we say, okay, that's not the same, we don't have a deal here. And it's interesting that here it's a bit like it grew first and then the law gets applied. So there's just a lot of this wild, wild west still. And that is partly this market pressure of we've always done it. It's already there. I think in a rule of law situation, you have to make sure that the rule gradually gets applied and moves forward. You could change the law. I mean, we can change the Charter of Fundamental Rights. We just need all the member states to agree unanimously that we change it. So I don't think that's going to be realistic from a very just practical point of view. So the reality is we'll need to really work. I think if we want to have practical solutions, first one is international agreements among democratic countries. That may take a while. In the meantime, to get at least the big tech providers to limit access from the US, that's doable. You could have a separate entity in Europe that hosts the data, and then you would actually fall outside of the US jurisdiction as far as we know. Just hosting the data in Europe is not enough. Like really, there has to be no physical access from the US anymore. That is also doable. And we see gradually that companies move towards that. I mean, they still oversell it. They say, oh, it's a European cloud. In reality, there's still some access. But you see that gradually it moves towards that. So
and they use cryptography in a very more consistent way.
Yeah. And in a provable way. The problem is that most of the stuff that we see right now, also these supplementary measures that were put out there, are laughable. Like they just like are 30 pages of bullshit. My favorite supplementary measure that Google, for example, had on its list is that they said, oh, we put a fence around our data center and the sign saying do not enter. That's going to deter the NSA, I'm sure. So what I think we really have to have more of a discussion is technically, and that's a reason also to probably mention, the supplementary measures were only brought up in our submission to the Court of Justice. No one else talked about it.
Okay.
We said if there's a technical solution, fine, especially because we wanted to tackle the issue of international data transfers going through a country. So if you have an end-to-end encryption, the US is in the middle, and from the metadata, you can't really tell where anything is going. What's the problem? So for that, we wanted to make sure that there are solutions. Now, what we see in all of that, and you sometimes, as a lawyer, you wonder if you should have made that argument because you wanted to be fair and wanted to do. We usually have a very academic approach to that, to say, fair enough, that's within the law, that's not, and we tried to put that in. And what we realized is that the legal industry, so to say, so the big tech law firms and so on, saw that little line in the judgment in the end and tried to fly a jumbo jet for this. And it's just like, this is just an exemption for very little situations. And so I think there could probably be innovative solutions to that.
You're supposed to be a lawyer. You should know what's happening.
Sometimes you're still believing in the good and the well. And so it's a bit the situation that there could be proper solutions and could be proper ways to solve that. We just don't see in reality that a lot of the companies actually do that. They use that and just produce 50 pages of bullshit to just give it to their customers and say, oh, there's 50 pages of bullshit. Don't read it and don't think about it. But, take that paper and say everything's fine. And everybody wanted that. Everybody's happy to say, oh, Microsoft tells me it's fine. And I had a conversation with one of them a while ago and said, actually with a big customer, said, ask them to put it in the contract that they are liable for all the costs if that is not legal after all. Turns out none of the companies would have a clause in that. They just say, oh, it's illegal. And I was like, if you're that convinced that this is illegal, put it in a fucking contract and be liable for it. And the answer is usually no. So that is a bit
painfully surprised.
Exactly. But once you put them to the test, you realize that a lot of that is just blah blah and bullshit. And but it still works. People increasingly love bullshit and just blah blah. And that's a bit the bubble that we're in as well.
The other thing that I see a lot in our line of work is the customer telling you, well, but we have European residency of our data.
Yeah.
That is enough.
Yeah, so that's actually a really interesting selling point that they put forward. And I think it's worth expanding on that for a second. So as far as I know, and I'm not an expert on US law, but I by now have to be kind of what my colleagues that really know best about US law tell me is that FISA 702 does not have geographic limitation. That is for sure, it just doesn't have that. Typically, the interpretation on the US side was that you have to provide the data if you have access, possession, or control of the data. So if you have some factual custody, possession, or control. So if you have some factual access to it. Same thing in Austria, I can tell you. Like if an Austrian bank has its server in India, you still have to provide the data to the police if they ask for it. But if you can't access it, you simply can't give it to the police, done. So we're getting back to the question of factual access. And I think that could be a solution for a lot of these situations, that once there wouldn't be any factual access anymore, you could actually host the data in Europe. But that's not about just geography, but that's about really having access from the US. There was a solution that Microsoft proposed in Germany that was kind of the idea that the actual hosting is going to be outsourced to a German provider. That they still sell the product and do all that kind of stuff. but that the physical location of the data and the actual access to the data is not done by Microsoft anymore. And that way,
any employees do not have. Yeah, I saw
Exactly.
that the same.
and that
The same
could
part.
work. That could be an interesting solution. You could even go a bit further. I don't know about Italy in detail, but in most jurisdictions, I guess, if you're a stock company, even if you're 100% owner, you don't have a right to direct the director
Yeah.
as the owner. So that could be a way to say, okay, I have a European director that is bound by European law. I'm still the owner 100%, but I cannot direct that guy. And if I would have a direction, that guy would have
Yeah,
to say, this
You
is
can place exemptions on the direction he has to follow.
yeah, not even there. That guy would have to say, that it's illegal. I'm not
Illegal
allowed
on my
to do
point of
that.
view, yeah, of
So
course.
you can give me all these directions, but I'm not allowed to break the law in Europe.
Yep.
I'm done here. And that could be a way that you host data in Europe and still have the possibility in the US to argue, I don't have possession custody control. Now, if the US, what the NSA reaction is going to be to that would be interesting in itself. But
Yeah.
that could be a way forward in the meantime to have some security here and some certainty. And if you back that up with, let's say, technical options where you can really prove that technically as well that it factually happens, that would be really interesting. And there is discussions in that direction. Once you talk to the big tech companies, at least in my experience, they all say yes, doable. But to be honest, our customers are not running away, and that would cost a lot of money. So our management is simply not there for it. And that is a bit where we see that simply the pressure is not on. It's not
Yeah.
strong enough. And all this shit suddenly works in China for whatever reason. But for Europe, no, can't do it.
Now, I may be wrong, but I think that kind of solution is the same that TikTok used by running Oracle-based, I think, data centers in United States without any kind of employers, without any kind of foreign person to have access to that one. And yeah, I think it's, well, it has to be worked out, upon, it has to be proven, it has to be without doubt, but it could be feasible in my point of view.
I don't know about the specific setup of TikTok. I can just say
me
in
too.
general that's doable as far as I understand. And it's, I think, second best solution. First best solution is fix the law.
Yeah.
Second best is react properly.
Yeah.
and that could be for the meantime an option to segregate in that sense.
Yeah, because the third option, having a totally different company identity, that could be a little bit tricky to implement.
Absolutely.
It could be.
And I think it's also important to stress, because in the US there is a lot of these false narratives that come. It's like that Europe only does that for protectionist reasons. Like, the Court of Justice is really interested in protectionism. And that's really the first thing that the Court of Justice does. And the Commission is not, and they are now fighting. It's just totally crazy. But to also, the more you have reasonable solutions and reasonable ways of doing this, the harder it gets to criticize these things. The harder it gets to say, all not doable. So I think that's an interest to find solution there as well. Solutions, plural.
I promised you to steal just an hour of your time, and I will stick to that promise. I've got one last question, and that is from me. So all the other questions were very informed. I'm just a bastard talking to you, but I have to do that. But before asking you the question, please take in account that I'm asking you. But it's the same kind of question that every activist dealing with privacy has had in more and more times during his or her life. So the question is quite simple, and is some experts consider disgraceful the so-called privacy weaponization. And I've heard about you and using privacy weaponization, etc. Do you think you are weaponizing privacy?
I think there's a lot of these narratives that go around, and we have that, especially at the office as well, that we're, privacy Taliban, privacy Nazis.
Here in Italy, it's normally privacy Talibans.
Where like so some of that you really wonder how aggressive people can get, because like, have you read a bit of history to compare, a fundamental right to privacy with what the Nazis did? So some of that is quite
I would
amazing.
think at the Nazis as the first instance of human rights. I
Yeah,
wouldn't
but
think.
like, especially if you're German speaking and you upset someone, you're quickly a Nazi. That is the truth
Yeah.
as well. So to deconstruct that a bit, I think, I mean, obviously what we're doing pisses off people and is really for certain business models, they're death, and for good reasons. I mean, it's like if you're the police, you're death to drug trafficking. That's your job to a certain extent, and you're not going to be liked by them, but that's still your job.
That's a strong point of view, but I can see what you mean.
Yes, I mean, if simply there is companies that
Yep.
simply absolutely have an illegal business model
Yep.
under the GDPR, and absolutely understandable that they don't like us, and that's fine.
Advertising.
Yeah. And there is advertising that is legal, but if,
Yeah,
for
of course.
example, you're a data broker and all your thing is I capture data from someone and sell it on to someone else without ever asking consent from anybody.
And I do elaboration on them, and I create personal profiles.
Like, you know that you're probably on a bit of a dying ship there. So back to the weaponization specifically, the word implies that you're using privacy for something else, because a weapon is usually a tool to kill someone for some other reason. And that is a narrative that comes up a lot as well, in the sense that privacy is used to, kill people from the market that are more innovative, and there's a lot of that. And I think generally we have to like really sit back with a lot of these things and really think about it more and be a bit more reasonable about it. Typically with this innovation narrative that oftentimes comes with the weaponization, it's interesting how they capture the idea of innovation to always be use more data for more shit, as if that would be innovative. It's a bit like, use more electricity, that's innovative. Sometimes it may be innovative to use less electricity and more efficiently, and and more safely, and so on. So I think with a lot of these narratives, we really have to first hollow them out and think, do they have a core that makes sense or not? To be honest, a lot of them, in my view at least, don't. And then we have to think of what they really try to say. And I usually say, it's very innovative to have a product that is not privacy invasive and still delivers the service. That is, in my view, more thinking and making stuff better and innovation in that sense than just holding more and more and more data that you don't even know what you're doing with. So I think that's really interesting, especially in this discussion, because it's a very technical discussion. It's very hard to understand what's really happening, especially for lawyers. Lawyers are used to know everything, but I see that even in our bubble. Once they have to look at code, they have no fucking clue what this machine is doing, but are still judging.
Several of them that knows about their stuff.
But there is a very big bulk of people that don't know how to code, don't know how to read code. Especially as a lawyer, if you don't know the facts, it's really hard to judge them. So we're still, and also for the general public, it's very hard to understand all of that. And legitimately so. I think also the general public does not have to understand all of that. There are experts, and that's probably the role also of many people watching this video, of making sure that the average Joe can go home at night after working for the whole day and just use an app or do something without having to worry about it all. And I oftentimes see as privacy a bit like, technical safety standards. We just go into a house and assume in a developed society that houses do not collapse unless there's an earthquake or something crazy, But generally you assume someone checked the house and someone made sure it's safe. Or that you go on a train and you go over 300 kilometers an hour and someone checked that this train is not falling apart. It's not your job. I think that is a bit where I see privacy is a bit in that direction, to say, if we get that, and we're at the very beginning of it, if we get it to developed level, the average Joe should be able to use it, use software, be able to trust it all, and not have to worry about it anymore. So I'm also a big fan of not trying to solve this issue with the average user has to be educated and understand it all. No one has ever understand all of this. I don't fully understand it. So we'd rather, I think, have to go towards a situation where we have proper enforcement by the authorities, well-trained people within the companies that say, guys, this is not possible, we can't do that, and get to a very stable solution around that. And that is going to be a very big effort. And I think also what's important to think about it, we're at the very beginning of the digital transformation, if you look at it. If you look at like the Industrial Revolution, even 150 years later, we're still fighting about how far do consumer rights go and workers' rights and so on. That's going to be an ongoing debate. And we're at the very beginning. So I usually say the GDPR is probably the least stupid law we have so far. But in 20 years, we're going to look back and say, oh, we didn't see these 5 things coming.
Did we really do that?
Yeah. And I think that's also fair to say, we don't, especially as an activist, you want to have all the solutions yesterday. But you also have to be realistic that this is going to be gradually going to move that way. And I think it's important for everybody in the bubble to work towards that. And that's a bit my worry with the GDPR after 5 years, is that it has lost a bit the fear of we have to do something, especially because of the lack of enforcement. That there is a bit of the feeling of, yeah, let's just do it with the old directive. Let's just pretend and have some privacy policy and not take care. And we have to work really strongly on that not being the truth, because I think it's also a matter of trust and also a matter of democracy. I think it's oftentimes important to stress that the GDPR had more than 90% approval in the European Parliament, which, I mean, get 90% approval of anything in a parliament, plus all the member states voted for it, other than Austria, because we thought it's not strict enough. But it has a very strong democratic and political backing. And now, especially the people in the industry and that work with it, talking it down every day, is to me also a bit of a disrespect for the democratic process and the rule of law. Because obviously 99% of the people working with it are on the other side of the game. That's the reality. But we also, I think, need to respect that there is a majority view on that. If you have polling, you see that people want to have privacy. So it's not something that some bureaucrats in Brussels came up with and pulled out of their ass out of nothing. It is a serious topic. It is a fundamental right, and we will have to gradually work on it. And that's at the same time, as a lawyer, for me, one of the reasons why it's the most interesting, one of the most interesting areas, is because it's a fundamental right on the one hand, but there's so much non-compliance. So that the delta is huge in this area. So as a lawyer, there's a lot of work to do to get the delta a bit closer together.
So, prides, regrets, would you have done the same thing over again, looking back?
To be honest, I will probably give it a big second thought.
Okay.
Mainly because I like to be in the second row. I like to just do stuff. And I absolutely lost my privacy over a privacy fight, which is super weird.
I'm sorry, Max, you chose the wrong,
absolutely.
wrong job for doing that.
Exactly. But, you know, suddenly you do interviews and then people realize that person is someone you can reasonably listen to and you're invited again and so on. So you gradually then do it up. Like
we literally fucked the Schrems I and Schrems II. So it's a little bit
for a long time. I was like, the safe harbor ruling, the privacy shield ruling. No way. I just got no way. And it's weird because like people oftentimes think you put yourself there, but you actually, like, we get, I think, 10 requests a day and we try to answer 2 if possible. While obviously the other way around, it oftentimes looks like you're pushing yourself into everything. And I'm the person that enjoys much more to really go through the law and the academic part of this, which you don't get to do that much anymore. And that's a bit where.
Was there a question that I missed? And you
There's
would have
always
liked,
100 questions.
no, you would have liked me to ask you.
I think I'm good.
So since you just told us that you have so many requests, so many possibilities. I'm very happy you were here.
Invite,
So thank you so much for being here with us today. I hope everyone else there out was happy. Just a second in Italian. Se parlate italiano e non avete capito nulla, non preoccupatevi, escono nei prossimi giorni le traduzioni. That is, if you only talk Italian and you didn't understand anything, we will be translating
that much Italian. That's the good thing.
And nothing more. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks a lot.
And see you next time.
See you then.
Ciao.
Bye.
L'appuntamento a cui state per partecipare è il primo degli incontri di PrivacyForFutures. In risposta a un panorama normativo che è sempre più complesso, a rapide interruzioni tecnologiche e all'assenza di approcci strategici e prospettici alla privacy, PrivacyForFutures rappresenta un cambiamento fondamentale verso l'apprendimento e lo sviluppo anticipatori nella gestione della privacy. Con l'obiettivo di potenziare i professionisti della privacy e della protezione dei dati, PrivacyForFutures offre intuizioni preziose sulle metodologie di previsione, dotandoli di strumenti avanzati per navigare e affrontare le sfide emergenti nel dominio in continua evoluzione della privacy. PrivacyForFutures è una piattaforma di apprendimento interattivo che favorisce un ambiente dinamico in cui i pari si impegnano e imparano gli uni dagli altri, guidati da un focus sulla comprensione, la condivisione e l'anticipazione, rispondendo alle esigenze di evoluzione dell'ecosistema della privacy. PrivacyForFutures è il risultato di un impegno collaborativo tra 3 entità altamente qualificate nel panorama italiano e internazionale. 42 law firm e P4I offrono competenze di alto livello e una rete di contatti significativa, mentre Longviews assicura la solidità delle metodologie e dei processi nel campo del foresight e del pensiero futuro. Se volete essere parte di questa nuova avventura, trovate più informazioni a www.privacyforfuture.it. Iniziamo!